the public challenge. The lights inside the grand concert hall glowed with the warmth of golden chandeliers that hung like frozen constellations above velvet balconies, each one filled with New York's finest, philanthropists, investors, and dignitaries who had come to celebrate another glittering evening at the annual gala of Slate Properties. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved silently like shadows across the marble floors, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Beneath the polite conversations and the soft notes of a string quartet playing in the background, there was an unspoken rhythm of power, wealth, and social hierarchy, where everyone knew their place and no one dared step out of line. For most of the guests, the evening was simply another parade of luxury and status, a reminder of their importance in a city that rarely slowed down long enough to look at the unnoticed. At the very center of it all stood Richard Slate, the man whose name carried the weight of skyscrapers and international deals. Tall, broad-shouldered, and impeccably dressed in a tuxedo cut from the finest Italian fabric, Richard was the embodiment of self-assured arrogance. He thrived in the spotlight, fed by the laughter of the powerful, and carried himself with the unshakable belief that no room existed where he was not the master of attention. As the string quartet finished its piece, Richard stepped toward the concert grand piano in the middle of the hall, placing one hand on the glossy black lid as if it belonged to him. His voice, smooth yet commanding, carried easily through the vast room without a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his words deliberate, his smirk widening as the crowd turned toward him. "Perhaps our evening needs something more than talk of numbers and contracts. Something artistic." His fingers grazed the keys as he lowered himself onto the bench with exaggerated grace. He struck a single chord, sharp and commanding, letting it reverberate across the hushed room like a gavel calling for order. He played a few bars of a complex classical piece, notes rising and falling with a mechanical precision that betrayed hours of practiced vanity rather than passion. When he finished, applause rang out from the circle of admirers closest to him, though much of it sounded more like obligation than genuine awe. Richard rose from the bench, bowed theatrically, and then allowed his eyes to wander the room before settling on one figure in particular, a woman in a dark blue polo shirt balancing a tray of crystal glasses with quiet determination. Her name tag read, Clara Henderson. She was a staff member hired for the evening, tasked with nothing more than clearing empty glasses and ensuring guests were comfortable. Yet in that moment she became the target of Richard's cruel sense of humor. His lips curled as if a joke had already bloomed in his mind, waiting to be delivered. "You there?" he said suddenly, pointing at her with a gesture too sharp to be mistaken for kindness. His voice carried over the crowd, forcing every head to turn toward her. "Yes, you with the tray, step forward." A ripple of laughter broke through the guests, some chuckling at the absurdity of pulling a server into the spotlight, others eager to witness the discomfort of someone who had no place on the marble stage. Clara froze for a heartbeat, her pulse quickening as hundreds of eyes landed on her like a sudden weight, pressing down against her shoulders. She tightened her grip on the tray, the crystal glasses clinking against each other in protest of her trembling hands. She wanted to vanish, to blend back into the safe invisibility of the staff, but the command had already tethered her to the room's attention. Richard's grin widened as he gestured toward the piano. "Come here, my dear. Let us have a little fun. If you can play this piece as I just did right here in front of everyone, I will make you the CEO of Slate Properties tomorrow morning." His words dropped into the room like coins into a fountain, absurd yet heavy, designed to humiliate rather than inspire. The hall erupted in laughter. A woman in a scarlet gown whispered loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "She probably doesn't even know where to put her hands." Another guest, Daniel Brooks, one of Richard's longtime associates, raised his glass of champagne and added mockingly, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare yourselves for the symphony of mistakes." Fingers pointed, smiles curled into cruel crescents, and the polished laughter of privilege echoed against the marble walls. Clara's throat tightened as if invisible hands were choking her. She set the tray carefully on a nearby table, the sound of metal against crystal slicing through the laughter for a fleeting second. She drew in a slow breath and stepped forward, her low heels silent on the plush carpet. The distance between her and the piano felt endless, every step widening the chasm between servant and spectacle. When she reached the piano, Richard leaned close, his voice dropping low enough for only her to hear. The burn of scotch clung to his words. "Do you really want to embarrass yourself? You don't even know where to put your fingers." His tone was dripping with contempt, not advice. Each word sharpened to cut. For a moment, shame clawed at her chest, threatening to swallow her whole. She remembered years of being unseen, her worth measured only in tasks completed silently. But then, like a candle lighting in the dark, another memory rose, the chipped keys of an old upright piano in a small Bronx church. Winter nights when her stomach ached from hunger, yet her fingers still danced across ivory and wood because music was the only thing that kept the emptiness from winning. She remembered her mother's tired smile when she played, the way the congregation hummed softly because they didn't know the words but felt the hope anyway. Her spine straightened, the trembling in her hands slowed. She turned her face to Richard and in a voice steady enough to silence the murmurs asked, "Are you serious?" Richard flicked his hand as if dismissing her doubt, his grin never faltering. "Of course, in front of everyone. If you play as I did, the company is yours." The crowd tittered again, but something in Clara's tone had shifted the air. Even the gala photographer, Miles Brown, who had been circling the room snapping casual shots, paused and lifted his camera, sensing the moment was no longer a simple game. An elderly patron, Mr. Whitman, who had been silent all evening, leaned forward, in his chair, his weathered face tightening with interest. The room had been expecting a spectacle of failure, but now it hummed with the tension of possibility. "I accept," Clara said, her voice carrying with surprising clarity through the hall. The laughter died. The room tilted, the energy shifting, as though no one had anticipated her agreement. Even Richard blinked, caught momentarily off guard before regaining his mocking composure. He pulled the bench out with a flourish and gestured toward it with an exaggerated bow. "Your throne, Miss Henderson. Enjoy your moment of fame." Clara lowered herself onto the bench, the leather squeaking under her weight. She let her hands rest in her lap for a moment, closing her eyes as the noise of the room faded into a hum. She inhaled, exhaled, then opened her eyes with newfound steadiness. Richard stood with folded arms, his smirk sharp as a blade. The crowd leaned in closer, their laughter silenced, curiosity pulling them like a tide. The chandeliers seemed to hum, the ticking of Richard's wristwatch clicking like a hidden metronome in the background. Her fingertips hovered above the keys, trembling once before finding their place. The hall held its breath, suspended in the fragile silence of expectation. Clara let her fingers fall and the first note rang out full and clear like the click of a lock turning. The second note followed, then the third. And soon the music began to flow, not as an imitation of Richard's performance, but as something entirely her own, rich with years of unspoken stories. And in that instant, the balance of the room began to shift. Memories in the music. The moment Clara's fingers touched the keys, the vast hall seemed to tilt away from mockery and toward silence, as though the building itself understood it was no longer holding an evening of shallow entertainment, but something raw and alive. The first notes emerged tentatively, soft as though testing the weight of air, but they did not falter. They grew steadier, threading into one another until melody replaced hesitation. People leaned forward unconsciously, pulled by the invisible hand of sound. Where Richard's earlier performance had been polished, cold, and showy, Clara's was different. It was warm, lived in, stitched with imperfection that somehow made it whole. Each phrase breathed like a living thing, carrying the marks of someone who had once played not for applause but for survival. Her mind, though fixed on the keys, slipped into memory. She was no longer sitting on the grand bench of the concert hall but back in the Bronx, a small girl with aching ribs from skipped meals, staring at the chipped upright piano donated to her church. The ivory was yellowed, the strings loose, some notes dead entirely, but she pressed anyway, finding music in what others called ruin. Her mother, exhausted from double shifts at the diner, would sit in the front pew with tired eyes but a proud smile, whispering to the neighbor beside her that her daughter played with more soul than the expensive musicians she'd heard on borrowed records. Clara remembered the sting of winter air that crept through broken windows, the congregation huddling together, humming along to tunes they didn't know but understood in spirit. In those nights, she had learned that music was not perfection. It was persistence. It was the voice of someone who refused to let silence win. Back in the hall, the notes poured forth with that same persistence. She played not as a servant performing under command, but as someone telling her truth in a language no one could interrupt. A woman in a scarlet gown, Valerie Eastston, had, moments earlier, mocked her with biting words, yet now Valerie's hand trembled, the champagne in her glass sending a thin stream down her gown without her noticing. Daniel Brooks, always lounging with arrogance carved into his posture, leaned forward as though his body had forgotten how to maintain superiority. Even the photographer, Miles, found himself lowering the camera for several measures, simply listening, before jerking back into focus, snapping pictures of her bent profile, her hands blurred in motion and the rapt faces behind her. Each chord Clara struck was not just music but a map of her journey. Nights studying by flickering fluorescent lights in an empty break room, mornings dragging herself to jobs that paid barely enough to cover rent, afternoons spent replaying melodies in her mind because she had no piano to touch. The rhythm of hardship and discipline gave her playing a depth no wealthy man could mimic. The gala crowd, used to rehearsed performances polished for their applause, found themselves unprepared for something so unvarnished yet commanding. They had arrived expecting a spectacle of humiliation. Instead, they were witnessing a quiet rewriting of power. The music climbed, carrying with it her private struggles, the day she buried her mother, clutching the hymn book with hands too young to be steady, the night she played in an empty church alone because grief made silence unbearable, the years of being overlooked in offices and events where she blended into the background like furniture. All of it bled into the melody, transforming personal pain into universal resonance. People in the hall felt the weight even if they could not name it. It was not simply skill, it was testimony. When the piece reached its height, Clara's hands moved with certainty born not from privilege but from repetition done in shadows. She was no longer aware of Richard Slate standing nearby with his smug smile faltering at the edges. She did not see Valerie's lips parted in shock or Daniel's wine glass set down forgotten. She saw only the keys, the path she had walked in secret, now visible in sound. For once her story was louder than the voices that mocked her. The final cadence arrived not as a question but as a verdict. The last note rang out, firm and undeniable, hanging in the vaulted ceiling before falling into silence. The pause that followed stretched endlessly. The kind of pause that occurs when people must reorient themselves when they realize they have been witnesses to something that demanded humility. Then, as if a single hand had begun it, applause erupted. One clap, then another, then the hall thundered with standing ovation, crystal glasses shaking in their holders as hundreds rose to their feet. Clara sat still, eyes closed, allowing the storm of sound to wash over her like rain after years of drought. She did not bow or smile for approval. She let the applause be what it was, an admission from those who had once tried to make her small. When she finally stood, the ovation swelled again, waves crashing louder because the audience needed a way to say they had been wrong. Even Richard, trapped by the gaze of his peers, clapped. But the sound of his palms was hollow, a performance without heart. People's eyes turned to him now, not with admiration, but with expectation. The promise he had made so casually, intended as a joke, now hung heavy in the air like a chain around his neck. The chant began softly, sparked by a single voice, then grew as others joined in. Keep your word. Keep your word. It gathered rhythm, rising above the applause, filling the space with a demand more powerful than any contract. Richard's smile wavered. He raised his glass in an attempt to lighten the mood. It was only a joke, my friends, he said with forced cheer. But the crowd was no longer laughing with him. They were staring, their faces carved with judgment, their voices insistent. Keep your word. Even the chandeliers seemed to vibrate with the chant as though the hall itself had chosen sides. Clara turned toward him, her face calm, her posture steady. She had no triumph in her expression, no gloating. Only the quiet strength of someone who had been underestimated too long. "Mr. Slate," she said clearly, her voice carrying across the room, "keep your promise." The hall hushed again, the demand now crystallized. The photographer lifted his camera once more, capturing the moment a woman in a simple polo shirt stood tall before a man trapped in his arrogance. The piano gleamed at her side like an altar, its keys still humming with echoes of defiance. In that instant, the joke was no longer funny, the game no longer safe. A servant had become the center, and a millionaire had been cornered by his own words. And the night was far from over. The weight of a promise. For several moments after Clara's steady words filled the air, the hall seemed to hang in suspension, as though every breath had been snatched away and replaced with a silent expectation that pressed down on Richard Slate like an iron crown. The applause had ended. The chant had taken its place, and now silence loomed again. But it was no longer the silence of mockery or indifference. It was the silence of judgment. Hundreds of eyes bore into him, eyes that once sparkled with approval and admiration, but now carried the weight of an unspoken verdict. His own laughter, which had so often commanded rooms like this, now sounded foreign in his ears, brittle and hollow. He tried to smirk. He tried to adjust his cufflinks with the ease of a man in control, but nothing felt natural. The ground beneath him had shifted, and for the first time in years he realized he was not the master of this stage. Clara did not move. She stood beside the piano, her hand resting lightly on its glossy surface as though acknowledging the instrument as her ally in this trial. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She simply repeated with quiet certainty, "Keep your promise." The calmness in her tone was more cutting than anger could ever be, because it revealed that she was no longer afraid of him. She was no longer the invisible staff member who blended into the background. She was the woman who had turned his mockery into music and his arrogance into shame, and there was nothing he could say that would undo what everyone had just witnessed. The chant resumed, softer but heavier. "Keep your word, keep your word." It rolled through the hall like the pulse of a drum, not wild or chaotic, but steady and deliberate, the way a crowd sounds when it knows it holds the truth on its side. Mr. Whitman, the elderly patron whose silence had lingered all evening, raised his voice just enough for everyone to hear, his tone calm but resolute. "We all saw what she did. Discipline, talent, dignity, more than many of us here have shown tonight." His words were not meant to flatter Clara. They were meant to pierce Richard, and they did. A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience, followed by renewed applause, this time not for the music, but for the idea that the scales of the evening had been reset. Richard swallowed hard, his throat dry as though filled with sand. He looked around desperately, searching for allies among the faces that had always supported him. He found Valerie lowering her glass, her lips pressed tightly together, no longer smirking, but avoiding his gaze entirely. Daniel Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his attempt at arrogance dissolving as he realized even his influence would not shield Richard from the weight of the room's demand. Investors, board members, donors, they all stared, waiting, their admiration now balanced on the knife edge of his next words. If he dismissed his promise, he would not only humiliate himself but expose his word as worthless currency. He tried again to deflect, forcing a thin smile. "It was only a bit of fun, ladies and gentlemen. Surely none of us believe." But his voice cracked against the tide of silence. The crowd did not laugh. No one rose to rescue him. Instead, he heard a woman's voice from the balcony, sharp and unflinching. "We believe what we saw. She played better than you ever have. Keep your promise." Applause followed again, smaller but decisive, like hammers striking nails into a coffin. Clara's gaze never wavered. She did not beg, she did not plead. Her steadiness was a mirror, forcing Richard to confront himself. For once, The arrogance that had carried him through decades of business deals and social games failed him. The room was no longer bending around his charm. It was bending toward truth. The photographer, Miles, captured frame after frame. Clara standing tall beside the piano, Richard caught between pride and shame. The crowd leaning forward with righteous anticipation. He knew instinctively that these images would outlive the gala, carried into newspapers, feeds, and broadcasts. He knew the world outside these gilded walls would soon demand what the room demanded now. The story was already too strong to be buried. Finally, Richard lifted his hands, palms outward, in a gesture that was half surrender and half desperation. His voice was thinner than he intended, stripped of its usual confidence. "Fine," he said, forcing each word through clenched teeth. "I acknowledge what you've done tonight. I acknowledge that you impressed us all." The attempt at generosity backfired instantly. The audience did not cheer, for they heard what he had left unsaid. He had not truly kept his promise. He had not named her CEO. He had not admitted defeat. He had offered a politician's half measure, hoping to satisfy the crowd without losing his pride. But the crowd was no longer willing to accept empty gestures. "Keep your word." The chant returned, louder now, the rhythm steady, undeniable. Richard's hand twitched as he reached for his glass again, but he knew it would not save him. The chant filled his ears, matching the ticking of his wristwatch. Click, keep your word. Click, keep your word. He felt trapped inside the echo of his own arrogance, forced to face the consequences of words he had once thrown like confetti. Now they had become shackles. Clara stepped closer, her voice steady, unyielding. "Mr. Slate, the promise was clear. In front of all these witnesses, you told me if I played as you did, the company would be mine. I have done my part. Now it is your turn." Her words were not just for him. They were for the hundreds who watched, for the thousands who would hear of this night, for every person who had ever been made small by those who believed power excused cruelty. The hush that followed was unlike any silence the hall had ever known. It was not the polite pause between performances or the hollow hush before a speech. It was the silence of judgment, heavy and complete. Even the chandeliers seemed still, their crystals frozen mid-shimmer as if waiting for his answer. Richard shifted, tugging at his cufflinks again, the nervous habit of a man who suddenly found himself exposed. His empire was not at stake tonight. His reputation was. And reputation, he knew, was more fragile than glass. Clara did not move away. She did not bow. She did not smile. She remained steady, holding the weight of the hall with the same quiet courage she had carried her whole life. And in that steadiness, the balance of power shifted completely. For the first time in his career, Richard Slate found himself standing, not above someone but beneath them, trapped in a storm of his own making. The night had begun with a performance, meant to entertain, but now it had become a trial and Richard Slate was the defendant. The jury had already delivered its verdict. The only thing left was the sentence, and the world outside these walls was already waiting to hear it. The weight of a promise expanded. The hall was no longer the same glittering playground of wealth and privilege it had been an hour ago. When the evening began, the chandeliers had thrown their golden light onto smiling faces. Laughter had echoed easily from balcony to floor, and Richard Slate had held the center of gravity in the room, like a king commanding his court. Now, however, that balance had shifted so sharply that it felt as though the entire building tilted on its axis. The chandeliers still gleamed, the glasses still sparkled, but the people beneath them were not laughing. They were watching, waiting, and judging. Clara Henderson, who had been invisible to most of them at the start of the night, now stood at the center of everything, and Richard, once untouchable, found himself cornered, his arrogance laid bare under the weight of his own words. Richard had always lived on the strength of his charisma. From boardrooms to banquets, from negotiation tables to television interviews, he had carried himself with the certainty of a man who knew he could bend any situation in his favor. His laugh had always been contagious, his wit sharp enough to deflect criticism, his wealth an impenetrable shield against accountability. But tonight, as he stood before hundreds of witnesses, his shield cracked. His laugh, once commanding, sounded forced and brittle. His carefully chosen words, "It was only a joke," just to lighten the mood, rang hollow against the silence of a crowd that no longer admired him. He reached for his glass of champagne, hoping to appear casual, but even the motion of lifting, it felt desperate, an attempt to cling to an image that had already slipped through his fingers. The chant began again, low and steady, not shouted in anger but spoken in unison with the calm certainty of people who knew they were right. Keep your word, keep your word. It rolled across the hall like a tide, growing with each repetition, weaving into the air until it became impossible to ignore. Some faces were stern, others disappointed, but all carried the same expectation. Richard Slate had made a promise, in public, and now the public demanded he honor it. Clara stood quietly by the piano, her posture composed, her hands resting lightly on the glossy lid. She did not raise her arms, she did not shout, she did not move toward him aggressively. Instead, she held herself with a dignity that made her presence undeniable. She did not need to fight for the room's attention. It belonged to her already. What struck the audience most was her lack of triumph. She did not gloat, she did not smirk at his discomfort. She simply waited, calm and steady, her gaze fixed on him with a kind of patience that was more devastating than any anger could be. She had already proven herself. She did not need to prove anything more. Inside Clara's mind, however, a storm was raging. Memories tumbled one over another. The years of invisibility, of scraping by in jobs where people never remembered her, name of being dismissed as though her presence was background noise. She thought of her mother, who had worked until her hands were raw just to keep a roof over their heads, and of the times Clara had been told directly or indirectly that she would never matter in the world of the powerful. Tonight, for the first time, the tide had turned. Yet she felt no hunger for revenge. What she wanted was something far more valuable than Richard's title. She wanted respect. She wanted acknowledgement that dignity did not belong exclusively to those in gowns and tuxedos, but to every human being who carried discipline, courage, and truth within them. The hall seemed to shrink around Richard as he looked from face to face. Valerie, once his ally in mockery, had gone pale, her lips pressed tightly together as though she wished she could disappear into her gown. Daniel Brooks, who had laughed the loudest earlier, now leaned back uneasily, his eyes darting as if calculating the damage this night would bring to his own reputation. Even those who had once treated Richard as untouchable, investors, partners, socialites, now stared with a distance that unsettled him. They had not forgotten his power, but they had seen something greater tonight. They had seen a woman with no wealth, no status, and no intention to perform for them command the entire hall with nothing but truth and music. Miles, the photographer, felt his heart pounding as he captured the scene in rapid succession. Clara, calm and steady. Richard shifting uncomfortably, the crowd leaning forward as if on trial with him. He knew he was documenting history, though perhaps not the kind people expected at a gala. Later he would write his captions carefully, but tonight he did not need words. The pictures spoke for themselves. They showed a reversal of power. The moment arrogance was stripped away and dignity stood tall. Richard finally raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, though even that seemed forced. "Fine," he said, his voice thinner than usual, the edges fraying. "I acknowledge what she has done tonight. It was impressive, very impressive." He spread his arms as though offering generosity, but the audience did not clap. They did not cheer. They recognized what he was doing, trying to give the appearance of humility while keeping his pride intact. He had not kept his promise. He had not named her CEO. He had chosen the language of evasion, and the crowd knew it. The chant swelled again, louder now. "Keep your word. Keep your word." The sound of it filled his ears, matching the relentless tick of his wristwatch. Click. Keep your word, click, keep your word. He felt as though he were trapped inside a clock, each second hammering the truth closer into him. He turned to the crowd, his face tightening. Surely none of you expect me to... But he stopped. Even he knew the excuse would not survive. Clara stepped forward, her voice calm but steady enough to silence the chant without effort. Mr. Slate, you made a promise in front of everyone here. I accepted your challenge, and I fulfilled it. This is not about me wanting your company. This is about your word. Do you stand by it, or do you break it? The hush that followed was almost unbearable. For a long moment, no one moved. No one breathed too loudly. Even the chandeliers seemed still, as though they too awaited his answer. Richard tugged at his cufflinks again, his old habit when cornered, but the gesture only made him look smaller. He realized that he was no longer in control of this night. He had lost the crowd, lost the admiration, lost the performance. All he could do was choose whether to step down with dignity or with disgrace. Clara did not waver. She remained steady, her eyes locked on his, her presence quiet but immovable. She had already proven the truth of her discipline, her resilience, her strength. She needed nothing more. The question now was not about her. It was about him. And the room, the night, and the weight of his own words pressed down with a verdict he could no longer escape. In that moment, Richard Slate understood what it meant to be small. The echo beyond the hall. The night did not end when the chandeliers dimmed and the orchestra packed away their instruments. It did not end when the last guests filtered through the revolving doors, or when the marble floors of the concert hall were left gleaming and empty. In truth, the night had only just begun. Within minutes of Clara's final note, the world beyond the walls of that grand room had already started to shift. Phones had been raised discreetly during her performance, recording clips that now traveled faster than whispers ever could. The gala photographer, Miles, had captured dozens of shots that would soon leave the safe confines of his camera and ignite conversations far larger than any of the guests could have predicted. By the time Clara stepped into the chill of the New York night, her story had already begun to take on a life of its own. On the sidewalk outside, Clara pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders. Jay, the young waiter who had whispered encouragement earlier, offered to walk her to the bus stop, his voice gentle, almost protective. She smiled faintly, declining at first, but he insisted on at least waiting with her. For once, she allowed herself the kindness. As they stood under the pale glow of a streetlight, the noise of the city rushing past them, she could still hear the echo of the crowd chanting inside her head. Keep your word. It was not anger, not mockery, but a steady reminder that she had not been invisible tonight. She had faced them all, and she had not bent. Meanwhile, inside the hall, Richard Slate lingered longer than necessary, moving from one guest to another with a forced smile. He muttered phrases like, "a great evening" and "memorable performance," his words falling flat into the heavy air. Daniel Brooks urged him to leave, whispering that they would handle things tomorrow, but Richard knew what awaited him outside those doors. For the first time in his life, he feared not the press, not his competitors, but the voices of ordinary people who had witnessed something undeniable. He had been exposed, not for poor business decisions or scandals, but for arrogance, for cruelty, for breaking his own word. In the world of power, reputation was built like glass, seemingly solid, but one crack was enough to spread and shatter the whole pane. The following morning, headlines began to bloom across the city. Waitress turns gala upside down with piano performance. Millionaire mocked employee and paid the price. Keep your word. Chant rocks Slate gala. Miles's photographs appeared online, the most striking one showing Clara standing beside the piano, her hand resting gently on the lid, her posture calm and steady, while Richard in the background looked unsettled, caught mid-motion with his cufflinks. The contrast between the two was undeniable. One carried dignity, the other desperation. Clips of her playing circulated widely, gathering views in the millions as people marveled at the depth of her performance and the story behind it. For Clara, the attention felt surreal. She had returned to her small apartment in the Bronx well past midnight, placing her worn shoes by the door and sitting at the kitchen table as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet by dawn, Her phone buzzed with messages she had never expected. A neighbor texted that they had seen her on the news. An old classmate sent a link to a video with her name trending across social media. Even her landlord, who rarely acknowledged her beyond rent notices, left a voicemail filled with sudden warmth. The world that had ignored her for so long was now calling her name, and she did not quite know how to answer. Opportunities began to arrive almost immediately. A local radio station requested an interview. A music conservatory extended an invitation to visit their campus, hinting at scholarship opportunities. Even the board of Slate Properties, embarrassed by Richard's conduct and sensing the shift in public sentiment, contacted Clara directly to discuss what had happened. They were not ready to hand her the title of CEO, but they knew silence was no longer an option. Their emails, filled with polite formality, asked for a meeting to explore possibilities. Clara stared at the words on her screen, astonished that people who would never have glanced her way last week now wanted to sit across from her at a table. The responses from the public carried more weight than she could have imagined. Ordinary people, those who had never attended galas or shaken hands with billionaires, shared her story with captions about dignity, discipline, and the courage to stand tall when mocked. Many saw themselves in her. Workers who had been overlooked, single parents who had carried burdens quietly, dreamers who had once been told they did not belong. The phrase, "keep your word," became more than a chant. It became a reminder that promises matter, that respect matters, that truth matters. Clara had not intended to start a movement, but her courage had tapped into something deeper, something people longed to see. Not everyone, of course, embraced the shift. Richard's allies scrambled to control the damage, issuing statements that downplayed the incident as light-hearted entertainment taken out of context. They insisted that Clara's talent was remarkable, but that the challenge was never meant to be taken literally. Yet the more they spoke, the more hollow their words sounded. Videos of the night made it clear. The promise had been made, the challenge accepted, the performance delivered. No amount of polished press releases could erase the evidence. And each denial only fueled more outrage, more voices demanding accountability. Clara, the question became not whether the world believed her, they did, but what she would do with the attention now thrust upon her. Sitting at her small kitchen table, she thought of her mother's sacrifices, of the countless nights she had played alone in the church, just to keep despair at bay. She thought of the jobs she had worked, the people who had dismissed her, the hours she had spent cleaning offices where no one even learned her name. And she thought of the piano, its keys under her fingers. The way music had always given her dignity, when the world tried to strip it away. She wondered if she was meant to step into the role Richard had mocked her with, or if she was meant to carve her own path entirely. The following week, Clara walked into the towering glass building of Slate Properties, not as a staff member serving drinks, but as an invited guest. Cameras flashed as she entered, journalists calling her name, asking if she truly believed she would become CEO. She did not answer them. She carried herself with the same steadiness she had held at the piano, refusing to let the chaos around her shake her center. Inside, the boardroom was filled with executives in tailored suits, their expressions a mix of curiosity, guilt, and unease. Richard sat at the far end of the table, his face tight, his cufflinks gleaming under the fluorescent lights. The meeting was not about contracts or titles, not yet. It was about respect. The board wanted to hear from her, to gauge her composure, to measure the woman who had turned a gala into a reckoning. Clara spoke plainly, without theatrics, her voice calm. She told them about discipline, about music, about how dignity mattered more than wealth. She told them she had no interest in being a pawn in their attempt to salvage reputation. If they wanted her voice, they would have to respect it, not manipulate it. Her words, though measured, carried the same power as her music. They cut through the noise and left no room for dismissal. By the time she left the building, the press was already buzzing with speculation. Some said the board was considering her for a leadership role. Others claimed she might turn the opportunity down entirely. Clara, however, was not thinking about speculation. She was thinking about the piano in the church, about the way her mother's smile had lit the room when she played, about the simple truth that had carried her all these years. Music was her refuge, but dignity was her victory. And in the weeks to come, as her story spread even further, she realized something extraordinary. Her victory was no longer hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had ever been mocked, overlooked, or dismissed, and it was their voices, not just hers, that now filled the air with the steady, unyielding rhythm of truth. The echo of that night had grown far beyond the hall. It had become a chorus. The true victory, the weeks that followed, were unlike anything Clara Henderson had ever known. Her days, once filled with quiet routines and the constant struggle of making ends meet, were now disrupted by ringing phones, invitations, and cameras waiting outside her apartment. What had begun as one night in a concert hall had grown into a movement, a story retold across headlines and news feeds, in classrooms and offices, in subway cars and coffee shops. Strangers approached her on the street, some just to shake her hand, others to say words she had carried silently for years. "Thank you for showing that people like us matter." It was overwhelming, but in its own way it was healing. For the first time, she was not invisible. The board of Slate Properties continued their awkward dance of damage control. They offered statements to the press, carefully crafted phrases about Clara's remarkable poise and unexpected talent, hoping to frame the incident as something inspirational rather than humiliating. Behind closed doors, however, they wrestled with their own reputations. Investors were restless. Emails poured in from clients questioning the character of the company's leadership. Richard Slate, once their untouchable figurehead, was now a liability. And yet in those boardrooms filled with strategy and panic, one truth became clear. Clara Henderson had become a symbol no amount of money could buy. She was dignity embodied, discipline proven, respect demanded. When Clara returned to their offices for a second meeting, the atmosphere was entirely different from the first. Gone was the thin politeness, replaced instead with careful deference. Men and women who had never before glanced at her now rose when she entered the room, offering her water, speaking with a softness that surprised even them. Richard sat quietly at the far end of the long glass table, his eyes lowered more often than raised. He had not spoken much since the gala, and when he did, his words were clipped, cautious, as though he had been forced to learn the boundaries of humility. It was clear he hated this new role, but he could not escape it. He had forged his cage with his own words, and now he lived inside it. The board's proposal was straightforward. They wanted Clara to assume a formal advisory role within the company, not as a stunt or a token, but as a real voice at the table. They admitted that the promise Richard had made was reckless, yet they also admitted that failing to honor it entirely would erode what remained of their credibility. They did not expect her to take over as CEO, but they recognized that her presence had already reshaped how the world viewed them. Clara listened patiently, her face calm, her posture steady. She did not rush to respond because she understood something they did not. Power was not always in titles or contracts. Power was in dignity, and she already carried it with her. When she finally spoke, her words were measured but firm. She told them she would consider their offer, not because she craved authority, but because she believed respect should guide leadership, not arrogance. She reminded them that people were watching, not for headlines or performances, but for truth. If they wanted her at their table, it would not be as a pawn, nor as a shield against criticism. It would be because they were ready to learn that respect is not a gift given by the powerful. It is a right carried by every human being. Her words lingered in the boardroom long after she left, hanging in the sterile air like music that refused to fade. Clara did not rush into decisions. She still returned to her Bronx apartment each evening, still walked past the small church where her earliest notes had been born, still stopped to touch the chipped upright piano when no one was around. She found comfort in its imperfections, a reminder of where she had come from and why her story mattered. She knew that fame was fleeting, that attention burned hot and fast before moving on, but dignity was different. Dignity remained. It was not hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had been told they were too small to matter. and she carried it now not as a burden, but as a light. Meanwhile, Richard's world continued to unravel. Investors distanced themselves, friends stopped calling, and his name, once synonymous with success, became linked to arrogance and humiliation. He avoided galas, avoided interviews, avoided the public eye altogether. For the first time, he knew what it was to be small. It was a lesson he had never intended to learn, but the echo of that chant, "Keep your word," followed him everywhere. In headlines, in meetings, in the restless silence of his own thoughts. He had mocked someone he thought beneath him, and in doing so, he had revealed the truth about himself. His downfall was not financial, not yet, but it was deeper. It was the collapse of respect, and without it, power meant nothing. Clara's life, on the other hand, unfolded into possibilities she had never imagined. Universities reached out with offers for her to study music formally. Non-profits invited her to speak at events about resilience and dignity. Young musicians, many from backgrounds as humble as hers, wrote letters asking for her guidance, telling her how her story had given them courage to keep practicing, to keep believing. She began to realize that her victory was not about becoming CEO, nor about humiliating a millionaire, but about proving that truth spoken or played through discipline could cut through the noise of wealth and status. Months later, when she stood on a different stage, not a gala, but a modest auditorium filled with students and families, she told them what she had learned. "Music has always been my refuge," she said softly, her voice carrying easily through the room. "But what I discovered that night was not about music alone. It was about respect. Respect for yourself, even when others try to take it from you. Respect for others, even when they do not show it to you. And respect for truth, because truth does not bend to arrogance, it waits, patiently until it is heard." The applause that followed was warm, not thunderous like the gala, but genuine, and for Clara, that was enough. In time, she accepted an advisory role at Slate Properties, but on her own terms. She refused to be a figurehead or a symbol. She worked quietly, insisting on fair treatment for employees, pushing for policies that valued people over profits. She did not seek headlines, though they came anyway, framing her as a reminder that dignity had a place even in the coldest corporate towers. She balanced this with her music, playing in community spaces, teaching children who had never touched a piano before, reminding them that their voices mattered no matter how the world tried to silence them. Her true victory was not the title, not the office, not the seat at the table. It was the refusal to vanish. It was the quiet strength of standing tall in a moment meant to break her, and showing the world that respect cannot be mocked into silence. Richard Slate would one day be forgotten, his empire replaced by new names and new towers, but Clara Henderson's story lingered, not because she became powerful, but because she showed that dignity itself was power. And late at night, when the city lights flickered across her window, she would sometimes close her eyes and remember that chipped piano in the church, the cold nights when music kept her warm, the smile of her mother who had believed in her long before the world did. She would sit at her own piano, her fingers finding the keys with ease, and she would play, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the truth that had carried her here. For in the end, the promise that mattered most was not Richard's broken one. It was the promise she had kept to herself, that she would never let anyone take away her voice. And that was the victory no one could deny.